Another question is about the progress. How much progress permaculture has done from since its beginning?
Well, in some ways we could say in Australia permaculture is better known than in any other country in the world, but it is still not taken very seriously in mainstream policy level. But amongst the population in Australia, permaculture is almost a household word. Now, many people would see it as just an ecological friendly way to grow food at home. And in that way, it has managed to infect Australian society as a positive idea, not necessarily a revolutionary idea. It's all right, we're not recording. So in Australia, it has had more influence over a longer period of time. But the amount of permaculture activism in Australia is a tiny fraction of the total around the world. Because, of course, Australia is only a country of 22 million people, whereas, for example, in the United States, there would be many, many more permaculture projects than in Australia. But proportional to the population, there is still more of this activism and projects in Australia than anywhere else, which is not surprising. But there are some permaculture projects or people influenced by permaculture in almost every country in the world. There are some countries, very significant countries, where that impact has been absolutely tiny, like China, for example. Where there are other countries like Cambodia and Cuba and Vietnam, where the influence has been through government extension services into supporting agriculture by small farmers, which is quite a different pathway from, say, in affluent Western countries, where a lot of it has been through a lifestyle change process for middle-class people, sometimes going from living in the city to living in the country. So there's many different processes in different places. So I think there's been quite a lot of progress in some ways, but in other ways, the lack of resources, that this has all happened with virtually no support from government and virtually no support from corporations. So it has happened partly through NGO groups, but mostly just people working at the individual level and the small business entrepreneurial level and the loose community level. And because it is operated at that level, there's a lack of resources to properly research and develop systems. So that has been, some of the lack of progress, I would say. For example, one of the things we identified in the 1970s in Permaculture 1 in terms of tree crop potential was the possibility of the oaks, Quercus species, 600 species in the world that all produce acorns that are potentially human food, and if not human food, animal food. The selection of these to get trees which are acorns low in tannin and to produce interspecies hybrids and new types. This work is still at the pioneering level by very small numbers of people doing this work, because there is no interest at the government level, at the research level to support this type of work. So in that sense, I see quite a personal frustration about many of the ideas and visions we saw in the 1970s are still yet to be even realised at a small scale. But on the other hand, this hybridisation with many other related ideas and finding other technologies or methods or things that people are doing in parallel to permaculture, which have strengthened permaculture along the way, has been very substantial. So in that way, permaculture has grown and made progress, not just in terms of influencing more people with the same ideas, but the ideas themselves have gained strength from many other influences. And especially in this move from the agricultural to the wider social domain. But it's also, permaculture's been very anarchistic process. So even someone like myself, as a co-originator of permaculture, I have no idea how many people have done the permaculture design course, which has been the mechanism of the spread of permaculture more than any other single mechanism. But I know this design course has been done by tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And there are books now, not just by myself and Bill Mollison, but by many permaculture teachers and authors in many different countries. Now, most of those books still come from English-speaking countries, but increasingly there are books from many other countries. For example, the small island state of Timor to the north of Australia, a very poor agricultural economy. For 20 years there has been a permaculture design manual in Tetum and also published in English, which is designed for village people. A spiral-bound publication of a very limited print run, but designed specifically for that environment and communities. So there are many different ways in which this is spread. I have books in Spanish by Cuban permaculture authors that have developed their own approaches. I would see this as quite successful when we look at the number of projects or things that are designated as being permaculture. But the other influence I would see is through many like-minded people with projects that are not designated as permaculture, but permaculture has been an influence on that work. So there's, in many places, people would not use the term permaculture because it might be associated with an alternative or countercultural approach and may not be as socially acceptable as some other framework. And we see this even in Australia, that there's quite a lot of influence of permaculture which is not called permaculture. So this is more a hidden agent of positive influence. And of course, some of those people are deciding not to use the term permaculture to describe their work for other reasons as well. And some of them may be because of their own critique of permaculture, which is that it is not developed in the ways that they think are important. So they have been influenced by the ideas, but they have moved on from it, leaving it behind. or also sometimes that they have such a high ideal view of what permaculture should be that they then have a very modest view of their own work and say, no, this is not yet permaculture. It is maybe a contribution towards it, but they are minimising the significance of their own work and putting a very high idealised view of what permaculture should be. For example, that permaculture projects should have total recycling of nutrients and energy and not be dependent on outside inputs. Yes. Well, in reality, very few permaculture projects are actually meet these criteria. So we can see some examples of permaculture around the world that I would say, as the co-originator of permaculture, these are not very good examples of permaculture, and I see a lot of other things in the world which are not labelled permaculture, but I'd say these are very good examples of permaculture. Yeah. So how successful permaculture has been is very difficult to measure, but certainly many of the ideas which we were talking about in the 1970s have now become adopted in a more mainstream way, possibly with no reference to permaculture at all. But that is maybe a different pathway of success.